Some people think a deadline can erase a lifetime of ownership. Mine was exactly 72 hours. The envelope smelled like fresh printer ink and lake water when I pulled it from my mailbox just after sunrise. A bright red stamp across the front read "Final Demand," and beneath it, in letters almost too neat to be threatening, the Willow Ridge Estates Homeowners Association informed me that I had exactly 3 days to surrender ownership of my 600-acre lake or face immediate legal action. I stood there listening to the quiet splash of bass breaking the glassy surface beyond my dock, while the morning fog drifted across the water my grandfather had loved more than anything else in this world. My name is Ethan Walker, and every inch of that shoreline carried my family's fingerprints. The weathered boathouse, the old cedar pier, the stone marker my grandfather set with his own hands back in 1968, they weren't just landmarks. They were chapters of our history. My father taught me to fish here before I was tall enough to cast a line without falling backward. My mother scattered wildflowers along the eastern bank every spring because she believed beauty belonged to everyone willing to respect it. After both of them were gone, the lake became the last place where silence still sounded like home. That's why the letter felt so absurd. You can't surrender memories. You can't sign away generations with a deadline printed in bold font. Still, the HOA clearly believed otherwise. Their president, Rebecca Collins, had spent the past year talking about community improvements, expanded recreation, and exclusive waterfront amenities for residents of the new luxury subdivision overlooking my property. She smiled for newspaper photos beside polished signs and perfectly trimmed flower beds, while promising prosperity to everyone who bought into her vision. What nobody mentioned was that the centerpiece of her master plan happened to belong to me. As I walked toward the dock, the wooden boards creaked beneath my boots with the same familiar rhythm I'd heard since childhood. A pair of herons lifted from the reeds, their wings cutting through the cool morning air. Across the lake, I noticed something that hadn't been there yesterday. Fresh white survey stakes lined part of the northern shoreline, each topped with bright orange ribbon fluttering in the breeze. Someone had crossed onto my property before sunrise. I crouched beside one of the stakes and brushed away loose dirt with my fingertips. The ground was still damp from where it had been driven into the soil only hours earlier. Beyond it stood a temporary sign with the HOA logo and a slogan that made my stomach tighten: Future Private Community Waterfront Access. They hadn't waited for my answer. They were already acting like they owned the lake. I looked back toward my cabin as sunlight finally broke through the fog, painting the water gold for a few brief seconds. My grandfather used to tell me that the truth always rises, just like the morning sun, even after the darkest night. At that moment, I wanted to believe him more than ever, because somewhere inside that cabin, buried beneath decades of family history, rested something Rebecca Collins had never counted on. And before those 72 hours ran out, the entire county was about to learn that some deeds don't just prove ownership. They expose every lie built on top of it. I carried the letter back inside without opening another cabinet or turning on a single light. The cabin already smelled the way it always had, like aged cedar, black coffee soaked into old wood, and the faint mineral scent that drifted in through the screened windows whenever the breeze crossed the lake. Every object around me had a story attached to it. The rocking chair beside the fireplace still leaned slightly to the left because my father had repaired one broken leg with whatever scrap lumber he had after a spring storm in 1994. The brass compass sitting on the mantel had belonged to my grandfather, Walter Walker, a commercial fisherman before he ever became a landowner. He used to tell me that a man who knows where true north is will never be completely lost, even when everyone around him insists he is standing in the wrong place. Walter bought this property in 1968, long before expensive lakefront communities, gated entrances, and carefully landscaped walking trails became fashionable. Back then, the shoreline was surrounded by oak trees, cattails, and dirt roads that turned into mud every time it rained. People laughed when he spent nearly every dollar he had on 600 acres of water, timber, and rocky shoreline that seemed too isolated to be worth much of anything. He simply smiled, shook their hands, and went back to building the life he imagined instead of the one everyone else expected. He cut lumber from fallen trees to build the cabin himself. He installed the dock one weathered plank at a time. He dug drainage trenches by hand after every heavy storm, because he believed taking care of land meant earning its trust instead of demanding its obedience. My father inherited that same philosophy. He never talked about wealth. He talked about responsibility. Every Saturday morning we walked the shoreline together, picking up broken branches, checking erosion along the banks, and making notes about water levels in a faded leather notebook that still sat inside the kitchen drawer. By the time I was 10 years old, I knew every cove, every hidden sandbar, every stretch of shoreline where turtles gathered in early summer. Those lessons never felt like chores. They felt like conversations with the land itself. When my parents passed away within 4 years of each other, friends encouraged me to sell everything and move closer to the city. They said the taxes would only increase, maintenance would become impossible, and developers would eventually make an offer too large to refuse. I thanked them for caring, but I never considered it. You do not sell the place that taught you who you are. Instead, I restored the cabin, repaired the dock after winter storms, leased limited fishing access to local conservation groups, and worked closely with the county to preserve the wetlands surrounding the lake. Some years were profitable. Some barely covered expenses. None of that mattered because every sunrise over the water reminded me why my family had stayed. The trouble only began after Willow Ridge Estates appeared on the western ridge 3 years earlier. At first it was only construction noise echoing across the water. Then came private security vehicles driving roads that had once been quiet. After that came glossy brochures describing luxury waterfront living, complete with photographs carefully cropped to make my lake appear as though it already belonged to the subdivision. Standing there in my kitchen with that demand letter still resting on the table, I finally realized something that had been growing for months without my wanting to admit it. Rebecca Collins had never built her dream community around my lake. She had built it around the assumption that one day she could convince everyone it had always been hers. The first time I met Rebecca Collins, she greeted me with a smile polished enough to belong on a real estate billboard. It happened at a county planning meeting held in the old brick courthouse about 18 months before that letter appeared in my mailbox. The room smelled like burned coffee and fresh copier paper, and folding chairs scraped against the hardwood floor as residents settled into another long evening of zoning discussions. Rebecca walked in wearing a crisp white blazer that somehow looked untouched despite the summer heat outside. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who believed every room eventually became hers. When she introduced herself as president of the Willow Ridge Estates Homeowners Association, nearly everyone nodded with polite approval. She spoke about family values, responsible growth, and preserving the natural beauty of the area. Every sentence sounded reasonable. Every promise earned applause. Only later did I realize how carefully every word had been chosen. After the meeting, she approached me while I was looking over a county watershed map displayed near the exit. Her perfume carried a sharp floral scent that lingered even after she stopped walking. She extended her hand and complimented the condition of the lake, saying she had admired it from the overlook many times. Then she casually asked whether I had ever considered partnering with the community on future recreational development. I thanked her but declined. The lake was private family property, and I intended to keep it that way. Her smile never disappeared, but something changed in her eyes. It was subtle, almost impossible to notice unless you were standing as close as I was. It was the look of someone hearing the word no for the first time in a very long while. Over the following months, I began noticing small changes around the property. Survey crews appeared near public roads more frequently. Expensive drones occasionally hovered over the shoreline before quietly disappearing behind the western ridge. Brochures advertising luxury homes started showing aerial photographs that featured my lake as though it were already part of the neighborhood. Prospective buyers would drive to the county overlook, point toward the water, and discuss future kayaking, fishing tournaments, and private community events. None of those activities had ever been approved by me, yet somehow they were becoming part of the sales pitch. Rebecca also developed an unusual habit of introducing herself to nearly every county official connected with planning, utilities, environmental permits, or tourism. She sponsored charity events, donated benches to public parks, organized shoreline cleanup campaigns that never actually took place on my land, and appeared in local newspapers often enough that people started assuming she represented the entire region instead of a single subdivision. Meanwhile, whenever I attended public meetings, I remained exactly what I had always been, a quiet landowner more interested in protecting the property than promoting myself. Looking back, I understand how effective her strategy really was. She was not trying to convince me to give up the lake. She was trying to convince everyone else that she already spoke for it. The dangerous part was not her confidence. It was how many people accepted her version of reality simply because she repeated it often enough. Standing on my dock that evening, I watched sunlight reflect across the calm water while distant construction equipment hummed beyond the trees. Rebecca Collins had never raised her voice, never threatened me directly, and never acted impatient. She did something far more calculated. She built an entire public story, where my family's lake slowly disappeared from memory, replaced by the image of a luxury waterfront community waiting for its final piece. And according to the letter still sitting on my kitchen table, she believed those final 72 hours would be enough to erase more than half a century of truth. I barely had time to finish my first cup of coffee the next morning before the campaign shifted into something impossible to ignore. The familiar rumble of pickup trucks echoed across the eastern shoreline just after 7 o'clock, followed by the metallic clink of trailer hitches and the steady beep of construction equipment backing into position. From my front porch, I watched 3 contractors unload stacks of decorative fencing beside the access road that led toward my dock. None of them looked surprised to see me standing there. One of them simply handed me a clipboard with a printed work order across the top. The client listed on the page was Willow Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. The project description read Community Waterfront Enhancement Phase 1. I asked who had authorized work on private property. The foreman glanced at the paperwork, shrugged politely, and said he had been assured every necessary approval had already been secured through the association. Before I could answer, another truck rolled in carrying freshly painted signs wrapped in protective plastic. By noon, those signs stood beside my shoreline, announcing future resident marina, private community recreation area, and exclusive lake access coming soon. The smell of fresh paint mixed with cut grass and warm pine needles as families from the subdivision slowed their cars to admire what they believed was the beginning of a new neighborhood attraction. Several even stepped out to take photographs, while children pointed excitedly toward the water. They were not trespassing out of malice. They honestly believed the advertisements they had been shown. That realization bothered me more than the signs themselves. Rebecca was not simply claiming ownership. She was selling certainty. My phone buzzed repeatedly throughout the afternoon. First came an electronic notice informing me that temporary access restrictions would remain in effect until ownership questions were resolved. Then an electronic newsletter from the association appeared in my inbox, even though I had never subscribed. It welcomed residents to the future centerpiece of Willow Ridge Estates and encouraged everyone to reserve premium boat slips before availability became limited. Attached was a digital rendering showing picnic areas, rental kayaks, floating docks, and a lakeside clubhouse positioned exactly where my grandfather's old cedar pier stood today. The image looked so polished it almost seemed real. Around 3 o'clock, I drove toward the county overlook, hoping to understand how far this had spread. The parking area was full of prospective homebuyers listening to a sales representative explain that exclusive waterfront privileges would dramatically increase neighborhood value. As he gestured toward the lake, I noticed glossy brochures featuring the same aerial photograph I had seen months earlier. Only now the map included property lines shaded in Willow Ridge colors as though the transition had already happened. I introduced myself quietly and explained that the lake remained privately owned. The representative smiled politely before saying there must be some misunderstanding because all of his materials had been approved through official channels. His confidence was almost identical to Rebecca's. Calm, friendly, absolute. Driving home, the tires crunched across my gravel driveway with a sound that usually brought comfort, yet that afternoon it felt strangely unfamiliar. Someone had already placed another survey stake beside the entrance gate, this one marked with bright blue ribbon instead of orange. The sun settled lower across the water, casting long reflections over the same shoreline my family had protected for decades. Rebecca Collins was not waiting for 72 hours to expire. Every passing hour was being used to create new assumptions, new expectations, and new witnesses who would swear they had always believed the lake belonged to the community. She understood something that many people overlook. If enough paperwork, enough signs, and enough confident voices repeat the same story, truth can begin to sound like the rumor instead of the other way around. I spent the rest of that afternoon doing exactly what any reasonable property owner would do. I called my attorney, gathered every tax receipt I had ever saved, printed copies of county parcel maps, and drove into town expecting that a few simple conversations would clear up what had to be some elaborate misunderstanding. Instead, every stop left me with more questions than answers. My attorney studied the notice carefully, adjusted his reading glasses, and frowned at several pages before leaning back in his chair. He admitted the association's claims looked unusually aggressive, but what concerned him more was the number of official references attached to the filing. There were planning documents, engineering exhibits, survey summaries, and multiple county references that made the package appear far more substantial than a routine dispute. He promised to investigate further, but warned me that responding within the remaining deadline would be difficult. From there, I drove straight to the county recorder's office, where generations of land records had been preserved for decades inside rows of gray filing cabinets and climate-controlled archives. The familiar smell of old paper and polished wood usually brought me comfort, but that day the atmosphere felt strangely uneasy. A clerk searched my parcel number several different ways before apologizing with an uncomfortable smile. According to the digital system, several supporting documents connected to my property had been marked unavailable pending administrative review. She could still see that records existed, but she could not access every attachment. She suggested returning another day after the review was completed. Another day was a luxury I no longer had. I left carrying fewer answers than when I had arrived. On my drive home, I stopped at a small diner overlooking the highway, hoping a hot meal might help me think more clearly. Instead, I overheard two men discussing the new marina plan for Willow Ridge Estates. They spoke with complete confidence about upcoming boat rentals, weekend festivals, and community fishing tournaments, never realizing the owner of the lake sat only 2 booths away. One of them even remarked that it was generous of the association to open such beautiful water to local families. I stared into my untouched coffee, realizing Rebecca's version of the story had already traveled farther than the truth. When I returned home, another surprise waited near the entrance gate. Temporary orange barricades blocked part of the gravel access road, accompanied by a laminated notice stating that vehicle access beyond that point would soon require community authorization. The paper looked official enough that delivery drivers or utility workers would probably never question it. I removed the barricades and folded the notice into the passenger seat of my truck, adding it to the growing stack of documents that no longer made sense. As evening settled across the lake, I sat alone on the dock listening to crickets replace the sounds of construction in the distance. The water remained perfectly calm, reflecting the first stars appearing above the treeline. Everything around me felt unchanged, yet somehow ownership itself seemed to be slipping beneath my feet without a single fence being moved. For the first time since the letter arrived, I considered the possibility that this was never intended to become an ordinary legal disagreement. It felt like a carefully rehearsed performance where every participant already knew the script except me. The survey stakes, the brochures, the temporary signs, the unavailable records, even the conversations happening in restaurants all pointed toward the same unsettling conclusion. Someone had invested enormous effort into creating the appearance of legitimacy long before I ever opened that envelope. If I wanted to understand what was really happening, I needed to stop reacting to each new move and start asking a different question altogether. Not who wanted my family's lake, but what they were so determined to keep hidden beneath its surface. I did not sleep much that night. Every time the old cabin settled with its familiar creaks, I found myself staring at the ceiling, replaying every conversation I had ever had. With my grandfather. Just before dawn, I gave up on sleep entirely, pulled on my work boots, and walked toward the boathouse carrying a flashlight and a mug of coffee that had already gone cold. The boathouse had survived more than 50 winters, and it showed every one of them. The cedar walls had faded to silver, the iron hinges carried a thin layer of rust, and the air inside smelled of old rope, lake water, and engine oil soaked deep into wooden floorboards. I had planned to replace a few warped storage shelves before summer, but now the simple task felt strangely important. My grandfather never believed in throwing anything away, and he had built nearly every cabinet himself. As I removed one weathered shelf from the back wall, My screwdriver slipped into an unusually wide gap behind the framing. Curious, I reached farther inside and felt solid wood where empty space should have been. I brushed away decades of dust until my fingers found a small brass pull recessed almost perfectly into the panel. I had walked past that wall thousands of times without ever noticing it. The hidden compartment opened with a soft scrape, releasing the dry scent of aged paper and cedar. Inside rested a flat metal document box wrapped carefully in oilcloth that had long since turned brittle with age. My hands actually trembled as I carried it into the morning light filtering through the open boathouse door. The lock had already rusted beyond use, so it opened easily. On top lay a handwritten note in my grandfather's unmistakable block lettering. It read, "If anyone ever questions where this lake belongs, begin here." Beneath the note rested several neatly organized folders tied together with faded blue ribbon. The first contained original survey sketches drawn decades earlier, complete with handwritten measurements matching the old stone markers still standing along the shoreline today. Another folder held photographs taken during construction of the dock and cabin, each labeled with dates, witness signatures, and locations. Then I uncovered something wrapped separately inside thick wax paper. It was the original property deed bearing the official county seal from 1968, preserved so carefully that the paper remained remarkably crisp despite its age. Folded inside the deed was an additional recorded easement agreement and a certified boundary survey signed by county officials years before the subdivision had ever existed. I spread the documents across an old workbench while sunlight slowly illuminated every page. Certain passages had been underlined in my grandfather's handwriting with small notes written in the margins. One sentence immediately caught my attention. It clearly established exclusive ownership of the entire lake basin, shoreline boundaries, and water access rights extending exactly to the original surveyed monuments that still existed on the property. My eyes moved from the deed to the survey stakes Rebecca's contractors had planted only the day before. They were not even close to the legal boundary described in front of me. For the first time since this nightmare began, the knot in my stomach loosened. The truth had never disappeared. It had simply been waiting in the one place nobody else thought to search. I carefully returned every document to the workbench, resisting the urge to rush into town waving proof in every direction. My grandfather had hidden these records for a reason, and judging by the careful notes he left behind, he expected that someday someone would mistake confidence for ownership. Looking out through the open boathouse doors toward the calm water, I realized something else. Rebecca Collins believed the countdown was almost over. She had no idea that the clock had just started running against her instead. I closed the document box, wrapped every page exactly the way my grandfather had left it, and carried everything back into the cabin without making a single phone call. Every instinct told me to drive straight to the courthouse and end the nightmare before sunset, but another thought kept interrupting me. If Rebecca Collins had gone this far based on paperwork she believed nobody could challenge, exposing the deed too early would only stop her plan halfway through. I wanted to understand the entire picture before anyone realized I had found the missing piece. So instead I arrived at the county courthouse just before 9 o'clock on the morning the deadline expired. The marble floors echoed beneath polished dress shoes. Quiet conversations drifted through the hallways, and sunlight streamed through tall windows that had watched generations of property disputes come and go. My attorney met me outside the hearing room carrying a leather briefcase that looked noticeably heavier than it had 2 days earlier. Inside were certified copies of the original deed, the independent survey, decades of tax records, historical photographs, maintenance logs, and every promotional brochure, reservation form, and public advertisement issued by Willow Ridge Estates during the previous several months. Rebecca Collins entered a few minutes later surrounded by board members, consultants, and legal representatives. She greeted people with the same composed smile I had seen since the first planning meeting, confidently shaking hands as though the outcome had already been decided. When the hearing began, her attorney spoke first. He described the association's long-term vision for responsible waterfront management, presented colorful development renderings, referenced recent planning documents, and argued that ownership questions had effectively been resolved through administrative filings. Listening from my seat, I realized something important. They spoke constantly about future improvements, community expectations, and projected benefits, but almost nothing about the original chain of ownership itself. When it became our turn, my attorney walked calmly to the front of the room without raising his voice. He placed one worn leather folder on the table and gently removed the original deed preserved by my grandfather decades earlier. Even from where I sat, I noticed several county officials leaning forward as the embossed seal caught the light. Certified copies followed, then the historical boundary survey, then the recorded easement agreement, each document building upon the last with quiet precision. The independent surveyor explained how every original stone monument remained exactly where the 1968 records established the legal boundary, while every recently installed survey stake crossed well beyond those lines. Next came the promotional materials collected during the countdown. Large display boards showed brochures advertising waterfront privileges, reservation forms accepting deposits for private boat slips, digital renderings placing community facilities directly on privately owned land, and newsletters describing recreational access that had never existed. Security footage confirmed contractors installing signs and boundary markers before any ownership dispute had been resolved. The room grew noticeably quieter with each exhibit. Rebecca's confident expression slowly faded as officials compared the original deed against the association's promotional maps. One planning administrator requested additional copies of the historical survey. Another asked why community marketing had continued while ownership remained legally unresolved. Questions that had once pointed toward me gradually shifted across the room toward the association instead. No dramatic speeches were necessary because the paperwork spoke with remarkable clarity. Every original record matched the next. Every modern claim depended upon assumptions that collapsed once the authentic chain of title appeared. The hearing concluded with the county recognizing the historical ownership records as controlling documentation pending final administrative corrections. Temporary restrictions affecting my property were ordered removed, and officials announced that several recent filings connected to the association would require immediate review for accuracy. Rebecca gathered her papers without saying a word. She no longer looked like someone unveiling a grand vision. She looked like someone realizing that decades of carefully preserved records could not be replaced by polished presentations and repeated claims. As I stepped outside, a cool breeze carried the familiar scent of fresh water from the lake several miles away. For the first time in days, I breathed without feeling the weight of that countdown pressing against my shoulders. My grandfather had written only one sentence inside the hidden document box, but standing on the courthouse steps, I finally understood why. The strongest proof of ownership is never the loudest voice in the room. It is the truth that has quietly waited all along for the right moment to be opened. The drive back to the lake felt different than any trip I had taken during the previous 3 days. The same 2-lane roads curved through the oak trees, the same fields stretched toward the horizon, and the same breeze rolled in through my open truck window carrying the familiar scent of pine and fresh water. Nothing about the landscape had changed, yet everything felt lighter. When I turned onto my gravel driveway, the first thing I noticed was that the temporary barricades were already gone. The bright signs promising future community waterfront access had disappeared as well, leaving only small impressions in the grass where their posts had stood. The orange survey stakes that had seemed so permanent only days earlier were stacked neatly beside the road, waiting to be removed completely. I parked near the old boathouse and walked slowly toward the dock, listening to the gentle creak of weathered boards beneath my boots. A blue heron lifted gracefully from the reeds exactly as it had on countless mornings before, as though the lake itself had simply ignored the entire dispute. For the first time in days, the silence sounded peaceful instead of uncertain. Over the following weeks, the official corrections arrived one after another. County records were updated to reflect the original chain of title exactly as my grandfather had preserved it. The independent survey became part of the permanent public file, replacing the inaccurate boundary references that had created so much confusion. Notices connected to the association's waterfront claims quietly disappeared from public listings, and promotional materials featuring the lake were withdrawn. Several residents from Willow Ridge Estates eventually stopped by my property, not to argue, but to apologize. Most admitted they had genuinely believed the advertisements because they had never been given any reason to question them. I invited a few of them onto the dock and showed them the original stone monuments my grandfather had, described in his handwritten notes. Watching their expressions change reminded me that misinformation often spreads fastest among good people who simply trust what appears official. Rebecca Collins gradually disappeared from local meetings and public events. I never celebrated that fact because the real victory had never been about humiliating another person. It was about restoring the truth before it disappeared beneath confident assumptions and polished presentations. A few months later, I opened the old metal document box once more and carefully placed fresh archival sleeves around every page my grandfather had saved. I added copies of the independent survey, the certified court records, photographs of the original boundary markers, and a handwritten letter of my own. I wrote about the 72-hour deadline, the survey stakes, the hidden compartment inside the boathouse, and the lesson I hoped the next generation would never have to learn the hard way. Before closing the lid, I placed my grandfather's brass compass beside the deed exactly where it belonged. It seemed fitting that the object he trusted to find true north would remain beside the papers that had guided our family back to the truth. As the sun settled behind the western shoreline that evening, golden light stretched across 600 acres of calm water exactly as it had when I was a child sitting beside my father on this very dock. The old cedar board still carried the faint scent of lake water and summer air. The stone marker my grandfather placed more than half a century earlier still stood exactly where he intended it to stand. I realized then that ownership is never measured only by lines on a map or signatures on paper. It is measured by years of care, quiet responsibility, and the willingness to protect what others see only as an opportunity. My grandfather was right all along. The truth does not need to shout to survive. It only needs someone patient enough to preserve it until the moment the world is finally ready to listen. Justice is not loud. It is smart, patient, and inevitable.